SEP FanFic Readings presents Measure of a Man by In a Daze 22. Chapter 40. Way Down We Go. January 1st, 2012. Nature continued to slumber long after the sun broke free of the horizon, but Hermione didn't. Drawing Draco from sleep, she took advantage of the empty house. "Good morning." Hermione's sleepy, sated smile stayed as she rose to her hands and knees and turned away from him. Curled against Draco's chest and coming down from the high of release, Hermione feathered her fingers back and forth along his jaw before brushing her thumb across his lips. This was by far my favorite way to start the day. The slight curve of his lips was all she saw before Draco entwined their fingers together and kissed the ring they'd decided to keep secret. Last night, she'd done just that with a pair of gloves during the muted fireworks that rang in the new year. Today, it would be accomplished with a concealment charm. No questions, no answers. For now, they would just enjoy the change so surreal it felt too right to be wrong. "We have nowhere to be until noon." Hermione dropped a kiss just above one of his old scars. With Scorpius and Andromeda's, it would have been longer, but Pansy decided last night to host an impromptu New Year's Day brunch at Theo's family's estate. Fancy attire for everyone, even the children. Draco didn't want to attend, but Hermione suspected the event had to do with Narcissa's lament over missing the society celebration. "If you have enough energy, we can do something else." Her original assumption had been more of what they'd spent the morning doing, perhaps in different locations, but Draco's idea led to breakfast and a trip through the flue to the empty former Malfoy house. After listening to the security briefing from the oars assigned to patrol the area, they changed into swimsuits. Draco swam laps with easy, unhurried strokes, while she laid on a towel and read a book. With the temperature charms turned up, despite being indoors, it felt like a summer day. And though the tale of a woman's quest to forge her own identity unshaped by the expectations of others made for an interesting read, Hermione's surroundings were far more captivating than the tale spun between the pages of her current book. Draco swam like he fought, effortlessly. Now, with the healed shoulder, he barely seemed to burn any energy during each lap. Each pass was sleep. He'd dip and turn upon reaching one edge and propel himself off the wall, resurfacing with a breath she scarcely heard before he powered through the water and repeated the process all over again. She could have watched him for hours, but Draco abandoned his solo pursuit to join her. He didn't get out of the pool, only rested his wet arms on the edge, giving her a heated stare. "What is it?" "Nothing." His eyes left hers and burned a path down her body. "Just admiring the view." Hermione rolled her eyes but laughed. "Has anyone ever told you that you're a terrible flirt?" And here I thought scheduling arguments was— "What?" Draco's amusement was vibrant in his deep chuckle. "You really were oblivious. Then again, I wasn't clear. Before you start overthinking, come here." The command was soft, and by the time Hermione moved to obey, he swam off towards the middle of the pool. "Before I overthink? You should know by now I'm going to do that anyway." Hermione abandoned her book in favor of jumping in the water that was warmer than it looked. The swim to him was slow, and she was out of breath when she surfaced. I'm not a strong swimmer." "You don't need to be." Draco was right. Time passed as they circled and occasionally splashed each other. Laughter and teasing jabs echoed in the empty space, but it was all stopped when Draco pulled her flush against him. Tension flowed between them like a river about to spill over its banks. Hermione locked her arms around his shoulders and her ankles around his hips. "Fiancé?" Hermione settled in his embrace. Gray eyes sharpened and his smile faded into something reverent. "What? I'm just trying the word out." "And?" His pause was long, and the silence loaded. "How does it sound?" "I like it, though I think our final names will suit each other best." Draco hesitated twice before drawing her into a kiss that spoke of tenderness, vulnerability, and a whisper of something he'd found without searching. Contentment. He wouldn't say more than necessary, but Hermione had already translated the language of his affection and returned it in kind. Once they emerged from the pool, she all but dragged him back through the flue to prepare for the brunch he admittedly attempted to distract her from remembering. It hadn't worked. By the time Hermione finished showering, selecting one of the many dresses she owned but never wore, and taming her hair into something respectable, Draco was ready. She took over fixing his onyx cufflinks. "Do you like it?" "I do." "Worth the trip?" Her question earned her a raised brow as his eyes dipped to the low cut of her fitted maroon dress. "I know you don't want to go." "I'm willing to compromise." But a choppy Patronus from Andromeda altered the course of the day. "Mungo's. Scorpius with me. Theo's office. Narcissa couldn't." Draco froze. Another nightmare was coming to fruition. "Went. Collapsed. Charles is with her. Stable, but—" Draco was gone before the message finished. Hermione sent Luna a Patronus asking her to come watch A before summoning her hospital badge and following Draco through the flue. Scorpius was wedged between Andromeda and Teddy on the sofa, leaning against the former and holding the latter's hand. Theo sat on the other side of the older witch, holding both boys together. They were all anxious, waiting. Hermione was jarred by more than just the occupants of Theo's office. Everything about it was different, even the location, judging from the window on the opposite wall. The decor was changed from the ceiling all the way down to the floors. She'd wondered if he'd found it just as difficult to sit in there as Hermione thought she would, but there was no time to reflect. Teddy was stiff, but his emotions were on display through the wild array of his hair colors, as Andromeda carted her fingers through the strands to comfort him. Scorpius was harder to read, looking anxiously at his cousin when his father signed to ask if he was okay. Andromeda stood and gestured to the other side of the office for them to follow. Draco led the way, but Hermione carefully stooped before the boys. Scorpius scooted closer to Teddy in clear concern for his cousin, whose silence contrasted the chaotic cycling of his hair. When Hermione cupped Teddy's cheek, a rebel tear finally slid free as Teddy closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. He swallowed thickly. "I tried to help. Nan said I did, but—" A few more tears broke free before he whispered, "I was scared." Just like there's happiness in sadness, there's bravery in being scared. Hermione soothed the teenager struggling to hold back a sob, swiping a thumb over his cheek. Her eyes slid to Scorpius, who was studying his hand, opening and closing his fist. She started to speak to him, to check how he was feeling, but Scorpius looked up. "Mum told me." Scorpius' small voice broke the silence. "It's okay to be sad." "That's right, love." Hermione reached for Scorpius's hand. "We all get scared. I'll tell you a secret. I'm scared too. It's normal. I don't know what happened yet, but I'm really proud of you both because you're here right now and you're being really, really brave." Teddy looked at his cousin, then her, before he wiped his face and caught his breath as his hair began to settle. Hermione didn't understand the context behind the teenager's fear just yet, but she gave each boy a piece of candy and left to join the others. When she looked back, she found Theo in Andromeda's former seat next to his godson. Only then did she notice the reverence on his face. Likely for the same reason a flush pinked Scorpius's cheeks. She often forgot the gift of the little boy's voice was still new for so many in his life. Offering them the privacy they deserved, Hermione turned her attention to those waiting for her. "This morning didn't start out well." Andromeda ran a shaking hand through her hair. "Narcissa was a bit listless after dressing for brunch, so Teddy came to keep her company while I got Scorpius ready. Charles and Keating were discussing the incident over breakfast when Teddy called for us in a panic." "Did anything unusual happen?" Draco asked. "Oh, she had some difficulty swallowing tea," which was both a new issue and a hint of the disease progression. The tension on Draco's face was a reminder of the research he'd done on his own. He knew. "When we came in, Teddy said she'd alerted him." Andromeda's voice was thin, yet steady, the embodiment of her inner war between ingrained restraint and devastating emotion. "Narcissa couldn't speak, couldn't respond, and then she fainted. Charles said her heart rate was low, too low, so he brought her here. She's stable for now, but completely disengaged. She doesn't remember anything or anyone, not even me." Narcissa always remembered Andromeda. "Charles asked me to wait here while he and Roger ran tests. He found a bruise and a little blood on the back of her head. At some point this morning, she must have hit her head on something and didn't tell anyone. He said a concussion would explain her symptoms." Hermione looked at Draco, who seemed to be listening with rapt attention. Like a sponge, he was absorbing her words with little reaction. "I'd like to see her." Hermione recognized the storm. She wanted nothing more than to calm it. "What room is she in?" "Private Suite 1. They peered over at the two boys and Theo, who was speaking very calmly to Teddy. Scorpius's head was barely visible over the back of the sofa, but what they could see of it was leaning on his cousin's shoulder. Hermione was the one to break the news. "We'll be right back, okay?" When Scorpius began to move, she placed a hand on his knee before signing as she said, "Stay with Teddy. Keep him company. He's better with you here, right?" Teddy nodded. Scorpius agreed slowly. Hermione kissed both of their foreheads, then headed for the door, turning just in time to catch Draco ruffling Teddy's hair when it flashed Draco's shade, before finally settling into a deep turquoise. He signed to Scorpius, gave Theo and Andromeda looks, and joined her. Their walk was slow as Hermione stifled her own growing thoughts and tried to focus on studying him. She clipped her identification badge onto her dress just in time for a Mediwitch to come around the corner. When Draco was asked for identification, Hermione stepped in with ease. "That won't be necessary. I'm escorting Mr. Malfoy to Private Suite 1. The witch allowed them to pass. The door to Narcissa's room opened just as Hermione was poised to knock. "I'm glad you are both here." Charles didn't seem surprised to see either of them. "How is she?" Draco asked. "Stable and resting. She's refusing to comply. Roger is finishing, and Sax is trying to convince her to eat something, so we don't have to take alternative methods to address her low blood sugar." Charles tucked his parchment and wand into his robe and looked back and forth between them. "Do you have a moment? We need to talk." Hermione didn't like the sound of that, but she followed as Charles led them both into his office. Next to her, Draco was stone-faced, devoid of emotions except the slight shake of his hand when their fingers brushed. They were in public, and he was occluding, but she wanted him to know, she needed to remind him, that she was still there. Beyond the wall built for self-preservation, she was standing by his side. She was on his side, with him, always. Their eyes met, and for a moment his cleared, focused, before he gave her a little nod. Something inside of her unfurled before they all entered a smaller room. An office. Charles' office. There were boxes packed in the corner, things he'd brought to start one position but had no time to unpack or sort before beginning another. His desk had a few personal effects, and 6 neat stacks of patient folders, but little else filled the space. Charles retrieved the parchment from earlier and floated it between them where they could all see. "These are her scans from today." A moment of searching his desk later, then a second parchment joined the first. Draco squinted while Hermione dug around for a spare pair of reading glasses she started carrying in her bag. Draco seemed surprised when she offered them to him. "These are from October, when she started the experimental potion." A few more parchments joined the first 2. These ranged from November through December. Several more lined up in his neat row, and these track each month since March, when Miss Granger did her baseline tests. Hermione had to step closer to see the differences, but they were there. "These results are unexpected." "How so?" Draco asked. Charles opened a folder on his desk, charming another set of results to blur the patient's name before they joined the hovering display and arranged themselves beneath Narcissa's. Hermione looked at each, not seeing the difference in the scans until... Well, the scan for November was different, as was December's, and today's. Hermione's interest was piqued. "When we began the experimental potion at the end of October, I said she was at the midway point of the disease. Her scans were identical to the patient I used as a baseline in my research. The new symptom today confirms my belief. It's normal to oscillate between phases, but when comparing results, He kept up September's scan through the most recent for both patients and waved off the others. "See here. If everything had continued along similar trajectories, all of these should look identical." But they didn't. Not exactly. Hermione held her breath. "Does that mean—" "I'm not sure what this means exactly, only that she was progressing as anticipated until November. Now the rate of decline doesn't align. In fact, she's trending over a month behind, give or take a week in some scans." Charles pulled today's scan over to the scans of the patient that should have trended in line with Narcissa's November. Those were identical. In fact, and I'll have to confirm, but I don't believe her results match any patient at her current phase. Additionally, I have noticed Narcissa doesn't have delusions. By this point, it's rare if a patient hasn't had at least one delusional incident. Persecutory, mainly, but your mother only has hallucinations. Draco took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. What does this mean? Today was the first incident of this kind. We'll keep monitoring her, and I don't plan to alter anything because it can be directly attributed to a physical cause. Keep brewing the experimental potion and propagating the ingredients. I don't want to speak too soon, but I have a suspicion that something in this potion is slowing the progression of her disease, even if only slightly. I don't know what, why, or how, but the scans are rather convincing. Theoretically, if we isolate the components and figure it out, we could... Hermione was surprised by the swell of emotion at the thought as it all came together. Slowing it down is just the first step. Eventually, we might be able to find a way to reverse it. Only in theory right now. Charles tapped his wand on the parchment. It glowed, highlighting the parts of Narcissa's scan where her brain was progressing differently than the other patients. We'll continue to perform routine scans, but this potion is more promising than anything else I've encountered in my years in the field. We can ask the research team to begin studying the potion and isolating the compound effects of each ingredient. Draco, what do you... All of Hermione's racing thoughts screeched to a halt when she noticed Draco's hand clutching behind his back. He was comparing the two scans that had sparked the initial excitement, yet he seemed troubled. Hermione said his name, but Draco looked away and down, turning his back to them and the scans. It's too late for her. His voice was toneless, defeated, as if the truth of something he'd known for weeks and months was sinking in all over again. Even if we isolate the cause of the unexpected results, she's progressed too far. Hermione and Charles exchanged looks. More experienced with comforting the families of patients, he took the lead. It is easy to focus on what will be lost, but your mother is still here, and she needs you now more than ever. Draco exhaled a slow breath, nodding solemnly. We will need to discuss care going forward, Charles said after a moment of silence. I believe the move to Andromeda's home has been for the best. The area is smaller, and there are less ways for Narcissa to injure herself, but her fall today means that she can no longer be alone. Some new safety measures must be enacted as well. No traveling by Floo alone, not even to familiar places. We will charm the floors to stop her from falling, and take other preventative measures. Believe it or not, occupational therapy has been helpful. She knew to alert Teddy that something was wrong. What does she want? Draco's question surprised them both. She's not giving up, Charles said with conviction. Her mood today is the result of what happened, and not her overall feelings on the matter. She wants to continue working to maintain her quality of life for as long as possible, and I intend to continue working with her. How long do you think she has? Up until today, I would have given her another year. Charles pulled down 2 sets of scans and looked them over. However, should she maintain this slightly slower rate of decline, I could safely add a few more months. It's hard to say anything definitive right now. I'll need time to sit down and compare these cases, quantify the changes. Knowing the potion is slowing the disease is one thing, but it's still a progressive disease. Inevitable. That's correct. Charles approached Draco, carefully placing a hand on his shoulder. I've admitted Narcissa. She'll need to stay here for a few days for observation, as she's refusing to eat anything at the moment. You two should go be with her, help her relax, and try to get something into her system. They left to aid in those efforts, and Hermione reached for Draco's hand as they stood in front of the door to the private suite 1. Do you need a moment alone? No. They entered together to find Narcissa alone and awake, staring in the direction of the window with the shades pulled back. She was far paler than Hermione had ever seen her, looking frail in the hospital bed. Hermione picked at the parchments, monitoring Narcissa's vitals, while Draco took the lone seat, then his mother's hand. His touch sharpened Narcissa's focus, but her eyes were still glassy. Mother. Draco. She tried to sit up, but he stopped her. You are here. I am. He seemed to exhale the same relief Hermione felt as Narcissa recognizing him. Rest. The snap of Hermione's heels on the floor made Narcissa turn to her, taking in her attire first. Are you a healer? Apparently Hermione's identity was temporarily lost. I am, but I'm off duty. I was just reviewing your vitals. She offered a patient smile, feeling as mixed as she often did when Narcissa forgot her. "I'm Hermione Granger. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Malfoy. I'm going to sit in the corner and monitor you, if that's okay." "Yes." Hermione swiped the folder Roger had left behind and took a seat, reading his notes while Narcissa's tired blue eyes focused on her only son. "I wish you were angry with me, Draco," she whispered sadly. "I wish we were still fighting." "Why?" His voice cracked with a torrent of emotions that battered the walls he'd built so high. "So you would not look at me like you are now." "I was angry. For years. Even after Astoria told me to let it go for my sake." Remorse appeared. Narcissa closed her eyes and bore its weight. "We were doing better, but I fear you think it is too late for us." Draco only looked down in response. His mother let go of his hand, bringing hers to his cheek and slowly caressing it. "I am still here, Draco." Narcissa spoke as firmly as her frail body would allow. "Try not to look at me like I am already gone." Draco leaned into his mother's touch, as if it were all he could do. His jaw tensed just enough to seal in his thoughts, but 2 whispered words slipped through. "I'm trying." The arrival of Padma and Theo could be explained, but Parvati being between them meant only one thing: trouble. They entered the room one by one. Arms folded, Draco's stance spoke of preparation for anything, but his eyes lacked the same fortitude. He was tired. Hermione remained where she was, but closed Roger's notes. She'd been too distracted to read them. The way Padma looked at Parvati to begin made even Narcissa take notice and sit up. In the end, it was Theo who cleared his throat. "I've already terminated the source of the leak, but the information is out." Draco stiffened. "What information?" "I was called into work to write a major story that's set to break." Parvati didn't hesitate. "Skeeter wants it released in the evening edition to beat the rest of the papers set to release in the morning." She stepped closer. "It's about you, Mrs. Malfoy. As of tonight, your illness will no longer be a secret from the public." Narcissa said nothing. "How much will it take to kill the story?" Draco looked ready to hand over as many galleons as it took. "The leaker was paid 4,000 galleons for the information in a bidding war that the Daily Prophet won. The other papers still know enough to publish their own version of the truth." "What information leaked exactly?" Hermione left the folders behind and stood at the end of the bed. "Is it something that can be disproven?" "We received copies of the records of today's incident. Parvati shoved her hands in her pockets. "I can say no to writing the article, but I have no access to steal the information back or erase it. There are copies and too many people know." It had already spread beyond the point of containment. "The hospital will take legal action on the leak for releasing confidential medical records." Theo was seething. "Their license will be suspended, and they'll be forced to pay back what they made plus more in penalties." Hermione's mind was racing. As far as stopping the news from getting out, you would have to move quickly and draw papers for approval to— "No." Narcissa's lone word silenced the room. "That will not be necessary." "But—" Theo's argument fell on deaf ears. "Pride cometh before the fall, but more than that, it is time to face this." Poised, in spite of her undone state and current condition, Narcissa's resolve was as strong as her spirit. "I have hid this for a long time. For what reason? To save face? Fear of pity or stigma?" "It's none of their business," Draco argued. "No, it is not. And Theo, do what you must to punish the person who violated my privacy. But I cannot run from this. I cannot hide. And I will not." "You don't have to do this." Hermione moved to Draco's side. "We can cover this up. We can— Who am I to you?" Narcissa's eyes narrowed at her. It wasn't rude, only curious. "You fight like I mean something to you." "You do." Hermione placed a hand on her frail leg covered in blankets. "You should be allowed to accept your disease without the world knowing, without the public making profit of your life, without— Why? When I die, rumors will swirl and bury the truth. Right now, I have just as little control over the muscles of my body as I do over how I will die. But this I can control. I have already told the story of my life. Now I would like to tell the story of what will ultimately cause my death, at least while I still can. Blue eyes shifted from Hermione to Parvati. Will you help me? I will. Parvati ignored everyone's looks except Narcissa. This is your story to tell, not theirs. Thank you, Narcissa inhaled. Draco seemed torn, but he nodded. What do you need, Patil? Parvati patted her bag. I have everything, but once I finish interviewing her, I'll need a quiet place to work on the article. It's due in 2 hours. You can use my office, Padma offered before leaving to update the others. Draco began to leave with Hermione and Theo, but Narcissa stopped him with one request. Stay. Some stories were easy to tell, others were not. Hermione always considered Narcissa's dementia one of the most complex, but still, she thought Scorpius should have been told of it months before. It was a battle she had reluctantly recused herself from, but now she learned it was also one she didn't need to fight. Leaned against her old office door, she watched a father and his son connect. After Narcissa's interview, Padma had brought both Malfoys here and summoned them lunch trays, but while Scorpius was happily working his way through the options, Draco had yet to unwrap anything on his tray. He focused on cutting slices of apples for his son as he talked in plain terms about what happened earlier that day. Much like he had about Astoria and the playground attack, Draco had explained it to Scorpius in his own time, in his own way. And here he was doing it again. Do you remember when I said your grandmother was sick? Scorpius nodded, accepting a slice and biting into it while Draco cut another. Do you remember what you're supposed to do when something's wrong? Get Mum, he signed comfortably. That's right. Warmth swelled in Hermione's chest as she thought back to August when he knew to alert her that something was wrong. She remembered his lack of reaction each time Narcissa called him Draco, or forgot who he was entirely. Maybe he'd been talking to Scorpius longer than she realized. The little boy couldn't possibly understand everything, but he knew enough, which was more important than ever. I can help. It was always Scorpius's first instinct. A tired smile curved the corner of Draco's lips. You already do. Like Teddy? Draco nodded slowly. Exactly like that. Scorpius was nearly finished with his tray when he signed a question instead of accepting another apple slice. Dad, are you sad? Momentarily taken aback, Draco blinked, but he never got a chance to answer. Hermione had been spotted. Not by him, but by Scorpius as he rushed to her side. All finished, she signed. Yes. Are you ready? Yes. For all of his eagerness and all the conversation they'd had about hospital rooms on the way to Narcissa's, Scorpius lingered by the doorway when they actually got there. Draco went to his mother's side, next to Pansy, and behind where Teddy was seated on the edge of her bed. Hermione put the tangerine Scorpius had insisted on bringing from his tray in her bag for safekeeping, and stayed with him. The little boy wasn't ready to enter, and no one would force him. Draco was the epitome of patience. He waited until his son met his eyes before extending his hand as both a bridge and a lifeline, all in one simple gesture. Face devoid of everything except a careful contemplation, she now recognized it as an expression reserved for Scorpius alone. Each little step was heavy with hesitation, and his hand tightened in hers, but Scorpius bravely made his way to his father's side before taking his hand too. Linked through the common thread of touch, with one little hand in each of their own, Hermione had another unexpected epiphany. Draco wasn't just being strong for his son, he was leaning on him too. They were all drawing strength from one another. Scorpius. Narcissa's voice was gentle. I am fine. She offered a weak smile to the little boy who was worrying his bottom lip with his teeth before getting his father's attention and signing a question. Surprise flashed across Draco's face, but he didn't let it linger. He wants to know if he can get on the bed with you. Narcissa didn't deny him. Scorpius joined Teddy, and Draco filled the space between his mother and Pansy while the teenager peeled tangerines Hermione retrieved from her bag at Scorpius's request. The first slice offered to Narcissa was rejected. I'm not hungry. She paused at the sight of an insistent pair of blue eyes. Maybe I will try one. One turned into 2, then 3. Pretty soon, Narcissa was accepting the cup of warm broth she'd previously turned down, while Teddy prattled on from one topic to the next, and Scorpius held her frail, petal-veined hand. It was nearly midnight when Hermione left Charles's office after reviewing countless case files, and she was greeted by Andromeda asleep in the reclining chair with her hand in Narcissa's. Teddy and Scorpius were curled up together on the sofa. Hours before, Ginny and Percy had come with dinner and left with Pansy. Kingsley and Draco were speaking by the window, the former placing a hand on the latter's shoulder. Before leaving, Kingsley fixed the blanket covering Andromeda, which roused her enough to notice him, and he placed a kiss on her hand as they exchanged soft words. At Hermione's first yawn, Andromeda insisted that she would stay, and they should take everyone home for the night. She woke Teddy first, then dragged Draco from the window to carry Scorpius, leading the way back to Theo's office, where the whirlwind had started. She made certain both boys were comfortable in their beds, then checked on Draco, only to find him in the shower. She joined him, and they bathed in silence. After they laid together, she let Draco occlude without question, in search of the peace he so desperately needed. When she was nearly asleep, he got up and said he'd be right back. Half an hour passed, then double that. Hermione discovered him by accident, little more than a figure in the middle of the pasture she'd noticed while searching the house. A barely noticeable breeze stirred trees and bushes as she walked out to join him. The moonlight highlighted what she'd seen rolling off of him all day in waves. Weariness. Draco took a sharp breath when she wrapped her arms around him. "Talk to me." "I don't know what to say." The unexpectedly honest answer caused Draco to clear his throat. "I'm tired." "Then let it all go tonight. You should rest." Hermione laid her head against his chest. Soon they were matching breaths. She was offering peace in the form of shared silence, and the balm of quietly reminding him of something he'd taught her in one of her lowest moments. The bravery in fear, the strength in surrender, the catharsis found in trusting another. "You're tired, and I don't think you've let yourself feel anything about this." She knew his silence was confirmation. "But you can't keep this inside." Not when it had been clawing its way out. Still, Draco stubbornly tried to fight it while looking to the skies. Then again, once they were inside on the ottoman covered in blankets. In the end, a lifetime of cracks connected, and he shattered. Healing was a cyclical journey of destruction and repair. "I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." January 2nd, 2012. Percy looked surprised when Hermione stepped out of the flue. "I know you were expecting Draco, but he's resting." Hermione watched Percy settle back in his chair. "I saw your name on his Magischeduler and thought I'd come in his place before I start my first day as temporary undersecretary. But not before making breakfast for Teddy and Scorpius, and taking the former to Harry and Ginny's to visit, while the latter crawled into bed with his father and a fed puppy." She left Draco a note, along with a cup of tea, charmed to stay warm. "I'm glad to hear that." Percy waited until she took the seat in front of his desk. "I was prepared to argue if he'd come through. How was Narcissa?" "Better today, it seems." Hermione had made a quick stop by the hospital before meeting Percy. Narcissa still looked tired. She'd recognized Hermione, enough to mention, with a quirk of her lips, that their breakfast had been delivered by Kingsley himself, making Andromeda fuss while she smiled into her tea. "They are keeping her for a bit to monitor her concussion." "I read the article last night. It was poignant, if a little bittersweet." Hermione had read it this morning when Padma had delivered a copy. "They've reprinted it in the morning paper." Percy nodded to a stack of different publications on his desk. "Outside of Tiberius's trial in 2 weeks for treason before the Council of Magical Law, it's all anyone is talking about." Theo's fielding everything. The news, the media, the request for comment, and he would continue to do so, even after she was back at Andromeda's. Until she said otherwise. "What were you and Draco supposed to meet about?" "Today's agenda." "Which is?" "I've had to take a different route with Draco's translations and the law research, as there is no single law to restore order in one declaration. I was going to go in there with everything I had, ready for war, but Draco suggested another approach." "Let me guess," Hermione smirked. "A softer touch." Percy narrowed his eyes. She'd gotten it right in one. "Let's forget about a particular law and focus on the root of the Wizengamot's power." Hermione frowned. "This entire system isn't built to last on a long-term basis. They've pieced together odd self-serving laws as patches. It's restrictive, inhibits growth, encourages inequality, and ultimately creates puppet leaders like the one sitting in a cell next to Tiberius. The purpose of the law that stripped the minister position of its power was intended as a temporary solution, but they've kept it in place and manipulated it. Percy's jaw tensed. When the Wizengamot took control of the government, the reason why made sense. Initially, at least. Kingsley was the 5th minister in 4 years. A group was thought to be more trustworthy than any individual. Until faith was restored in the head of the government again, it was logical for the Wizengamot to step in as an impartial oligarchy. They are anything but impartial. Exactly. Percy stretched his neck from side to side. The law was for 10 years of Wizengamot intervention, but 2/3 had to agree to restore the minister's power after that. And then the chief warlock had to sign off. But when 10 years were up, things were worse than ever. We began pressing for a vote, but they refused, which is why I started the restoration. Hermione let his words sink in. I still find it all interesting. What? Why has no one on the Wizengamot dug deeper into the laws that keep them in power? Why has no one thought to use their perceived power to access the law books at Cambridge Magical Library, or even the archives in the Hall of Records? They're either unbelievably arrogant, or it's likely to do with the lack of an overt challenge. They got comfortable and complacent. When Percy folded his hands, Hermione knew she had his full attention. But go on. The continued existence of these law books and scrolls Draco found point to their failings. If they were smart, they would vote to abolish each measure of opposition as they're discovered and presented. True, but they can't. They don't understand the implications of each law or their translations, nor do they know the foundations of the system they are sworn to uphold, no matter how terribly they seem to be at their duties. In the process, they could destroy themselves, and by extension, the government. Self-destruction at will. Hermione toyed with her compass necklace. Might not be such a bad thing. No, maybe not. But we don't have the time for a ministry-wide scorched earth policy. This is what you would have forced them into doing, had you decided to go in there and challenge everything all at once. She dusted a stray bit of puppy hair off her pinstripe blouse. The shutdown taught us that they are more than willing to sacrifice to avoid losing. Percy's frown deepened in acceptance. She wasn't wrong, but there was more to consider. Hermione spent several minutes looking over his work, skimming the translated scrolls in Draco's terrible handwriting, and thinking about it while Percy sipped his water. We have 2 options. Hermione stood up and paced the room. We could subdue them with their own corruption, or fight it by strengthening the laws that reduce the capacity for such corruption to happen again. We have the ability to establish a clear definition of the government's reach. How would I do that? By giving them a reason to turn the balance to the ministry. Percy tapped his fingers against the desk. If it becomes more of a burden than a benefit. Exactly. They still won't agree. It would be easier to just walk in with demands, and we were successful once with that method, but only because we made a spectacle by bringing in the people. It was a power move, and I will admit it worked. But we can't keep making power moves. They had to be smarter, more subtle. What is it that you need to accomplish first? I have a list, but right now I'm working on a way to reinstate the Public Information Services Department. The last minister dissolved it, and turned public relations into something the Wizengamot Administration Services handled, giving control of what the public was told to those corrupting the ministry from the inside. It would make the fight against the Death Eaters or any future threats more efficient, especially when it comes to issuing public warnings, which had not been done for as long as Hermione could remember, if ever. Officially, the threat level was still listed as light green, but in reality it was quite the opposite. Changing the official designation would raise budget allowances for security, and public events would be handled differently, like Quidditch games, which went against Tiberius's objective to eliminate his problems. Okay. Every new piece that fell into place only served to reignite Hermione's anger, but she had to focus. Let's start small, with something we can tackle immediately. What could circumvent this particular rule? That's the thing. This department is modern. There are no translated laws that apply. Hermione sat down and crossed her legs, leaning her elbow on the arm of the chair as she pondered through every option. You could list out everything this department would be in charge of in excruciating detail, like a first-year's potion essay. If it's anywhere near as backed up as the rest of the ministry, it would overload them, especially if they're all urgent. They'll reach a point where they have to agree to pass it back or risk being exposed for negligence under the new leadership. That's morally gray, not to mention manipulative. Percy pursed his lips. But it might work. All for the greater good. From there, you systematically peel away their power, one unenforced law at a time. Draco's translated laws can reverse or override the measures they've put in place. Technically, you don't even have to do anything for them to work like that. All you have to do is point out the flaws in the laws they established without bothering to look to see what existed beforehand. By rooting out and exploiting the technicalities in the legal language that were never properly explored, and just pushed through for their own personal gain, you can use what they changed against them. Percy pinched the bridge of his nose. It'll be a slow process, but a systematic one they won't understand how to stop. Hermione shifted in her seat. I think you know as well as I do that restoration was never going to be a single act. I'm aware, but I'm also under a time constraint. Oh? Percy took a deep breath. I'm resigning effective the 1st of February. What? It wasn't my plan. Not something I thought I'd ever do. Percy looked around his office. But sometimes, in order to weed out corruption, you need a person on the inside. Oh! Hermione inhaled sharply. You're joining the Wizengamot. Yes. He nodded, and it was hard to read his thoughts on the move. Kingsley asked me the night he took over. I'm assuming one of the fallen members' seats, and so are a few other members of the Restoration. Hermione winced, still unimpressed with most of them. I know what you're thinking, but I believe what we've uncovered has made them all a bit more determined to correct the injustice from the inside. The additions, plus the change of heart from the weaker members, would be enough to make real change and fulfill their ultimate goal, restore balance to the ministry. What I'm doing now is preparing my successor to take up the cause once I leave. I plan to have everything I need from McLaggen before the trial begins. And until then, I'm going to peel away the rot, piece by piece. Percy chuckled low. And using your method, I might even enjoy it more than I thought. Hermione laughed with him, but caught sight of her watch, rising to her feet. Her first meeting was in 10 minutes. When Percy stood as well and picked up his wand, she tilted her head. I believe you need an escort, Madam Undersecretary. Hermione's arrival was met with a silence too deferential for her liking. After introducing herself to the 20 or so new faces and hugging Dolores, she shook Kingsley's hand and followed him to the office door already plated with her name. I made certain no one removed anything that belonged to the prior Undersecretary, Dolores said with a smile. Oh, and thank you for the bomb. How did you know I was nearly out? Hermione paused. She hadn't given Dolores. Oh. The level of competence required had one explanation. Draco. Any time. Hermione's slow smile took credit for something Draco would never admit to. How have you been? Much better now that Kingsley is back and change is underway. Dolores and her secretaries have been vital to the transition, leaving the offices preserved with locking charms and finding information. Kingsley gave her a patient look. I will leave you in her capable hands. I have a full schedule today putting out bureaucratic fires. Welcome back. I believe there was something delivered for you. Delivered? When Kingsley was gone, Dolores took out her wand and aimed it at the door. Outside of clearing the desk of documents and moving them to the chair, everything's been kept the same, as requested. Hermione pushed the door open and looked around. The office was larger than expected and cluttered to the point of obstruction. Parchment, scrolls, and folders commanded every surface, including the sofa, chairs, and side tables. There was a wall of bookshelves hidden by a line of folders stacked almost as high, but she couldn't focus on any of it. Not when her delivery was sitting in the middle of the only clean surface in the room. The desk held only a fresh roll of parchment, a few quills, and a note folded next to one last thing Hermione knew wasn't courtesy of the secretary standing next to her. A steaming cup of tea. How long ago was this placed here? She wandered to the desk and picked up the note. You left without this. DM. Her suppressed smile faded when she noticed Dolores' curious stare. Your house elf, Zippy, delivered it 5 minutes before your arrival. A note from someone special, I take it. Yes. There was no sense in hiding it. Well, I'll leave you to enjoy your tea and get set up. I've made certain no one will bother you today. She frowned in confusion. Why not? You need time to settle in, dear. No, I don't. Hermione picked up her tea and drew a long inhale of bold hibiscus. There's work to do, people to meet, and things to figure out as I begin to navigate this role. Do you have a list of the candidates for various staffing positions?" Dolores looked rattled. Yes, of course I do." "Could you get those for me?" Hermione drifted over to the chair, picking up a folder on the top of the stack. "Also, can you spare anyone to go through these with me?" As it turned out, they couldn't, but Hermione took to the task between meeting individually with the staff, learning their names and roles, and creating an ever-growing to-do list for the coming days. The first few files weren't very interesting, aside from being personnel files specifically requested by the minister that hadn't been delivered prior to his arrest. She didn't notice anything alarming. She briefly wondered if they were suspected Restoration members, but if that were the case, the old minister was either an especially bad detective, or the Restoration's influence was much broader than she knew. Honestly, either option was more than viable. Moving on, she drifted across the room to the first set of bookshelves and plucked a file from eye level. The whole world opened with one look. The prior undersecretary might have been silently complicit, but they recorded everything. Every correspondence between them and the minister or Tiberius. Every request, denied, approved, or strategically ignored. Every deal made, officially or otherwise. All in black and white, right in her hands. Complaints from every department were recorded and compiled together, filling up an entire bookshelf on their own. Most were against Tiberius, Cormac, and the minister, everything from harassment to negligence to wrongful termination. Several members of the Wizengamot had formal complaints mixed in the stacks. Flipping through file after file, Hermione's heart ached for the people victimized for so many years by a broken system and the power-hungry tyrants allowed to run it without oversight. It would take time to create a trend, but each piece of information would be invaluable in the coming months as Percy, and then his successor, dismantled them piece by piece and exposed their incompetence just as they deserved. By the time Hermione noticed the clock, hours had passed, and she had a healthy stack of evidence that needed to be hand-delivered to the legal department for review. While attempting to put them in some semblance of order, there was a knock on her door. 2 raps, then a third. Hermione hadn't heard that knock in a long time, but she knew who it belonged to. "Come in." In the doorway was Draco, as expected, but it was Scorpius who came bearing a small gift box. Everything was put on pause, and Hermione barely pushed her chair back before the excited boy was at her side. "Hi, love." She pressed a quick kiss to his temple, and he preened. Draco did the same, albeit more subtly, when she rose to her feet and offered him the same greeting. It was new, not something they'd done in front of Scorpius, but natural nonetheless. She turned back to Scorpius, who wasn't paying them any attention in favor of finding an empty spot on her desk to put the box. "What's all this?" "A few things for your new office." Draco leaned against the side of her desk and peeked at the empty teacup. A smile ghosted his lips. Scorpius insisted. His accusation was confirmed with an enthusiastic nod. Hermione cleared a spot for him and glanced over at Draco. "Better today?" "Yes." Satisfied, Hermione proceeded to give her attention to Scorpius, who was bouncing from foot to foot. He really wanted her to see something. A cutting of bamboo, a picture of them from Christmas, artwork chosen from the wall of their home office, and a familiar glowing potato. Hermione set each item in their new place and thanked Scorpius with a hug. Then, when they were all safely secured on her desk, just to his liking, he finally broadened his focus to the office at large. Her very disorganized office. Scorpius's eyes grew 3 times their size. "I have a lot of work to do, huh?" He nodded. "I can help." "Not today." Draco chuckled and scooped up his son. "We're going to visit your grandmother." "I was just about to take these folders to the legal office. I found some additional evidence against Tiberius and the minister. You can come with—" Hermione stopped when Draco's eyebrow began to climb. It dawned on her just what he was thinking. "I'm pretty sure Dolores saw you and Scorpius." "She did, and not for the first time. She suspected something since you and Scorpius started coming to my office with lunch. She also knows I was on administrative leave for—" They both stopped and looked at Scorpius, who was listening far too closely. One little blonde brow sat high on his forehead. The resemblance to his father was strikingly adorable. Draco coughed. "In that case, you two wait here. I'll be back." January 10th, 2012. Hermione would have given him the world, But Scorpius only asked for one birthday gift, for everyone in his family picture to celebrate with him. He didn't care how or where, just that everyone was together. And though they had to make an exception for Teddy, who'd already boarded the Hogwarts Express back to school, he'd been granted permission to flu call from the headmaster's office. Next year, they'd arrange something early so he could be present. Scorpius's wish led to a full house. It was chaos with Halia crawling, the kids scrambling around, and Lily loudly trailing after all of them. There were a few new additions to the festivities that weren't included in the painting, too. Kingsley came with Andromeda, and Charles brought his wife. Given her friendliness with Andromeda, the assumption became clear that they had at least met. Another surprise was Gregory Goyle, who had come abroad ahead of his wife and children to look for a home that hadn't been tainted by his family's history. According to Draco, he was staying with Theo during the search. Hermione hadn't been around during each of his prior visits, so when he stepped out of the flu, she had to orient herself quickly to the foreign concept of an adult Gregory Goyle. Standing in front of the fireplace, it was easy to see that he'd grown into his once hulking figure, now taller than Draco, but not quite as tall as Blaise. Goyle's hair was still bristly, and his eyes were small, and seemed strangely reserved, a word Hermione would never have associated with the child she'd known at school. Draco's hand warmed the small of her back as he introduced her. "She's forever passed in the span of a single breath. Mine." The glint in his eyes spoke silently of something she already knew. He was hers, too. "Good to see you." Greg offered his hand with ease. Once upon a time, this simple action had been beneath him, influenced by bigotry and scorn. He hadn't considered Hermione someone worthy of such civilities. But today they were starting over. Sure, they had met before, but they were different people, both then and now. "It's nice to see you again, too, Greg." Knowing everything Draco had told her about Gregory Goyle prior to his arrival, his struggles during the war, after watching Crabbe die, moving to America, meeting the witch who eventually became his wife, and how much she bettered him along the way by helping him heal and emerge from the darkness, it made it easy for Hermione to accept his olive branch. Their paths had been similar, no matter how different. No two journeys of growth and change ever looked alike. "Welcome." She leaned into the warmth of Draco's palm and gestured for Greg to join the others. Hermione sent Draco with a displaced houseplant in danger of Lily's wrath and a request to clear the children and puppy out of the conservatory. Met with a silent protest, she held his gaze until he huffed and went about completing the task, drawing the attention of the children who surrounded him in a flash. Greg looked over his shoulder while Draco put the plant on a shelf, too high for little hands to touch, then reached down to pick up Halia before she crawled past him. James and Albus bounded out of the house ahead of Scorpius, who was holding A. His new watch was beeping, tuned to the time needed to take the puppy outside, and the boys jumped at every opportunity to assist. A smiling Lily hung off of Draco's other arm, and he stopped when she pawed at his jaw to get his attention. She leaned close and then whispered, "I chase squirrels." Draco just blinked, not even dignifying her comment with a response. Hermione and Greg coughed. Halia and her uncle exchanged looks before she babbled something to him. "Right," he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I'll be back." For just a moment, they were alone. That's the last thing I ever expected to see. Greg's accent was worn smooth from years of living in California. Draco's always been awkward around kids, even his own. I tried to give him advice, but... He shrugged. "I see things have changed." "They have." "Good." He dropped hints on our flu calls and in letters, but it's nice to see for myself. Nice to see Scorpius. He's so different. My wife won't believe it when she sees him at the wedding next month. "Oh?" After our last visit, his sorrow left her bedridden for 2 weeks. Greg shook his head. "My wife's an empath, and she's sensitive to intense emotions. When we first met, she said my loneliness made her avoid me until she couldn't. I know she'll be happy to see him doing better." "Healing takes time. It's been a journey, but it's far from over." "I know that well." "So do I." A look of deep understanding passed between them before Hermione took out her wand to stretch and lengthen the table with a flick. Greg stood by as she transfigured the chairs, but stopped when she noticed him watching like a child who wanted to join. "You can help if you like." "Oh!" He pulled at his sleeve. "I'm no good at transfiguration." "Do you practice?" "You sound like my wife." The thought of her swept his stiff features into a soft fondness. I practice, but I destroy more than I create. We're working on it." Hermione continued making chairs for everyone while Greg looked around. "This isn't what I expected when he first told me about this place." "When was that?" "Here and there. I learned most about your greenhouse after you were hurt, and Draco realized how much of what you grew was strictly for wolfsbane. I helped facilitate some new connections for a more reliable supply. He has it all outsourced now, right?" She stopped and looked at him. He doesn't talk about the details." "Can't imagine he would. At the time, he sounded lost." Greg cleared his throat. "Anyway, he asked and I made it happen." "I see why he wants you to manage the apothecary." "I thought he was just too lazy to do it himself." Greg shook his head. "But now I realize he has more occupying his time than brewing and caring for Scorpius." Hermione tucked a curl behind her ear and summoned the table runner and plates from the kitchen. The runner stretched the length of the table before flattening itself, and each plate landed in front of a seat. All finished, she looked at the job well done, ready to lead the way back to the rest of the guests. "He wants to start renovating in July. Any reason why?" Greg asked. She couldn't think of one. I'm not sure." Greg's comment was all but forgotten by the time the party began in earnest. Scorpius spent the entire time red-faced, unaccustomed to being the center of attention. He received more gifts than he asked for, a video full of birthday wishes from her dad and Fiji, a collection of suspenders and knitted bow ties from Percy and Pansy, and a few gifts from the Potters, including dog treats for the puppy. Fresh out of the hospital, Narcissa gave him another memory. This time, he seemed to recognize the significance, another thing his father must have explained to him. Nearly everyone else got him books. He'd have his own library soon enough. Scorpius couldn't seem to decide what to do first, but Draco already had plans, which moved the party, one by one, through the flue to the Malfoys' former residence to utilize the indoor pool. By the time Hermione entered, holding the birthday boy's hand while he looked around with wide eyes, those who weren't swimming were lounging around on sofas, with Zippy happily serving drinks as laughter, conversation, and infectious energy filled the air. Greg was conversing with Percy, which was the oddest match she'd ever seen. A few adults were swimming with the kids, and Scorpius pulled Hermione over to join them. Already wearing arm floaties, he wasn't nearly as shy about his gathering as he had been on Christmas. Harry and Ginny had corralled 2 of their 3. The only one left was Albus, walking back and forth on the edge and talking with animated gestures to a blank-faced Draco in the pool, with his arms folded, subtly making sure the partly inattentive child didn't fall in the water. When George swam over and convinced Albus to jump in, it effectively ended Draco's guard duty, and he swam across the pool to join Hermione and Scorpius before Albus could resurface. His tattoos were glamoured as a measure of armor for the day, not that she could blame him. She was hiding something, too. Hermione swapped her thumb along the inside of her palm and was greeted by the warm hum of magic. When Scorpius peered at the water, she looked at Draco. "You've never taken him swimming?" "No." Looking a bit embarrassed, he shook the excess water from his hair and opened his arms, ready to catch his son should he decide to jump in. Scorpius didn't. Not initially. But when Draco stepped closer with one signed request, "Trust me," Scorpius plunged into the water. The moment that passed between them when Scorpius resurfaced in his father's arms was indescribable. They were both beaming. "Getting in, Granger?" "No, I'm going to stay for a little bit, then go back to make sure everything's ready for dinner. Maybe next time. You two have fun." And they did, along with everyone else. Draco took a patient lead, helping his son get used to the pool. Neville and Luna were swimming around, while Daphne sat on the edge with Padma and Pavarti. The latter two cooing as Dean introduced Halia to the water. The baby looked about as skeptical as Parvati when Charlie tried to coax her into joining him. Apparently, Parvati couldn't swim, but she relented and took her first tentative step onto the ladder, demanding that Charlie not let her drown. He wouldn't, nor could he with the way she clung to him while a smiling Charlie drifted away from the edge. Padma whistled low when they were far enough away. "I've lit a candle for Charlie's sanity every night since Christmas." Dean and Daphne laughed as Hermione sat down on the edge. "I wouldn't worry." Hermione smiled. "He tames dragons for a living, and seems to be doing just fine with this one." That only made them laugh harder. "I've heard he's extending his trip home long enough to come to the wedding." Pansy looked far more serene than she had at Christmas. "Percy told me." "I thought it was interesting, too." Dean made faces at his babbling daughter, who gave him a smile wide enough to show off both of her teeth. Then she put her wet hands on his face before trying to shove her fist in her mouth. "And on that note, pool time is over. How do you feel about peas?" Halia blew raspberries, which sounded like approval. Dean walked over to the stairs and got out to dry them both off and take her back through the flue. Daphne just smiled at her family before glancing over at another branch of it. Draco was showing Scorpius how to use the arm floaties, Hermione watching as well, her face growing warmer by the minute. "Are you blushing?" Daphne smirked. "No." "You are!" Pansy drifted closer. "Must be the baby fever." Hermione sputtered through a cough. "Hear me out. I had a touch of it while shagging Percy this morning, and yeah, but no. The orgasm temporarily eclipsed my good sense." "They tend to do that," Padma added. They all burst into fits of laughter. "But if that's the case, let me put some distance between us." Padma scooted away and ignored Hermione's glare. "Blaze and I are on a 5-year if-ever plan." "I do not have baby fever," Hermione argued. "We're still enjoying it all without worry, thanks to contraceptive potions." Daphne eyed her. "But you are thinking about it." "Not at the moment." Hermione shook her head. "We haven't even talked about it since Scorpius asked for a brother." "He what?" All three shrieked loudly enough to draw attention. At the table, Susan offered them a cocked eyebrow before deciding she was better off not knowing and returning to her conversation with Charles and his wife. Ron was approaching, but quickly turned back to where a laughing Angelina was standing at the edge, talking to George, who had Albus on his shoulders, mimicking the way she held her hands on her hips. Curious gray eyes met hers from across the pool. Scorpius waved with a toothy grin that she returned. They were drifting in the direction of Harry and Ginny in the shallow end, where Lily was sitting on her dad's shoulders. When Hermione looked back at her friends, they were all still staring at her with wild eyes. Waiting. "Oh," Hermione sniffed. "He didn't ask per se, but he drew a picture of his family, and it included a brother for him." Daphne and Padma cooed as if it were the cutest thing they'd ever heard. Pansy laughed and playfully splashed water in her direction. It didn't reach. "I see you have yet to say no." "Well, I'm not, but I'm not saying yes either. I like how things are. I'm not opposed to staying like this or growing, but I'm leaving it up to Draco. For now, we've tabled the discussion, and we'll revisit it at a more relevant time." "It'll be sooner rather than later, judging from the way he looks at you." Pansy waved off Hermione's eye roll. "Seriously, I'm shocked he hasn't proposed." "This soon," Padma balked. "Soon? It's far from uncommon. Draco's been courting Hermione for months." Daphne shrugged. "When you know, you know." Pansy's eyes narrowed into slits when Hermione did everything possible to avoid drawing suspicion. Her heart was racing, and her palms were warm, though from the concealment charms or her nerves she wasn't sure. "I am also surprised you haven't shunned the idea." Pansy studied her every move. Hermione stayed very still. It was another conversation topic. Padma whistled low, looking impressed. "You two went straight for the serious topics." "We wanted to be on the same page, which went as far as setting expectations for ourselves and each other." Their biggest concern thus far, and the subject of most of their talks, had been one of the easiest parts of the transition. Scorpius. He didn't know yet of their engagement, but only because there were no secrets between him and Albus Potter. Just as there were few secrets between Albus and the rest of his family. News would spread everywhere before either of them could blink. It wasn't a bad thing, but the timing of Narcissa's hospitalization coupled with everything else complicated matters, and, well, she liked having this little piece to themselves, for now. For us to seriously consider the future, there were a lot of things to discuss, like changes to the house, for instance. Building an indoor pool, adding a second floor to conservatory, and a library for all of the books we currently don't have room for. Catherine's role once Scorpius starts school. What happens when I start classes in March? We're even looking into more assistance for Andromeda now that she'll be caring for Narcissa. Well, at least some type of assistance she'll be willing to accept. "There is that." Pansy shook her head. "Never thought I'd meet someone more proud. I offered to help with the layout changes needed, and Andromeda insisted on paying me." "Yes, we're having the same issues, but Draco's wearing her down. Or, rather, negotiating." Hermione had only witnessed one of those sessions, and the standoff between the two looked less like a conversation over tea than a battle of wills. After glancing at her watch, Hermione stood. "I should get back to get everything together." "This isn't over, Granger." Off-key voices sang happy birthday to a blushing Scorpius and cheered far too loud when he blew out 6 candles on his tangerine-shaped cake. While everyone ate, he approached Hermione to straighten his bow tie for pictures. "Did you make a wish?" Scorpius shook his head. Hermione tilted hers. "Why not?" The little boy leaned close and whispered, "It came true." When her brows knitted in confusion, Scorpius shyly pointed in the direction of his artistic interpretation of their family, and she understood why he hadn't made a wish. He'd already gotten it. Tired from an afternoon of swimming and fun, the 4 kids and puppy fell asleep during the opening credits of a cartoon film. The number of guests dwindled until only the closest family and friends remained. Narcissa decided to take a nap in the guest room, while the rest arranged around the table in the conservatory. Hermione set the charm to alert them if a child stirred. "All ready for school next week?" Ginny asked. "The children are excited." "About that." Hermione rubbed her temples. "Catherine will be back in 2 days, and she'll collect assignments each week to teach them here until things settle. Security still patrols the woods around the house." Speaking of security, Theo pulled several small vials from his coat, a little security measure of her own. Hermione's eyes widened. "How did you—" "I skimmed a few doses of the vaccine off the top when we delivered a shipment a few days ago for the Wizengamot members. I've taken one. Hermione doesn't need one, as she'd already been exposed to the poison, and I've been slipping them into everyone's attendance today, who didn't stay. What's left is for you all." "Cho?" Padma gave him a look. "She's taken care of." Padma's eyes softened. "Thank you." "No need to thank me." Something unspoken passed between them before Theo gave her a small nod. Padma accepted the vial in his outstretched hand. "Narcissa?" Andromeda asked as they all reached for a vial. "Charles and Draco are working on that. I gave Charles a vial today to test for potential interactions with her current potions. We're scheduled to work on it." Draco tipped back his dose. "Are you figuring out the dosing for the children?" "Yes. I have a team working the logistics now, but Hermione and I have a theory there won't be other attacks like we've seen in the past now that the potions master is dead, and they have no means to replace him. Whatever stores they have is all there is, and we hope to find it and dispose of it, all before they can organize another attack, now that their hideouts are being systematically raided. Have you all found where they're keeping it?" "No, or I would have razed it to the ground." Draco's comment earned him a small nod from Harry. "Theo," Percy said once Pansy finished wincing at the aftertaste, "have you limited my movements?" Theo had been surprised to learn their plan for him. "Yes. I've also increased the security at the hospital and warded my office, limiting who has access to only those in this room. Staying at my family's estate, traveling only via flu." "That sounds intense." Greg, who Hermione had forgotten about, looked around. "I heard the news off and on, and from Draco and Theo, but it's been an interesting year. Well, 13 years, actually." Draco straightened when the small chime rang out. "Incoming." About 30 seconds later, the vials were vanished, and James came in with a request that moved the crowd into the living room. Albus wanted a sign language lesson. From Draco. "Uncle Draco's much better at it than Dad." Albus gave Harry a weak smile. "Sorry, but it's true." "You don't need to apologize." Green eyes glinted mischievously before he turned to Draco. "I'm certain Malfoy would love to give you all a lesson." "Fine." Draco gave Harry a glare cold enough to solidify mercury, but when he caught sight of the excited children, a slow, mischievous smile spread across his lips. "At least your children recognize natural talent." Harry's amusement vanished. "Oi!" "You kind of asked for that one, love." Ginny smacked her husband on the back and cackled. Ron was about to leave, but changed his mind and rejoined them for the show. Hermione smiled when the children insisted Draco needed to join them in the circle on the floor. Harry and Theo watched from the sofa after both were summoned by Al and Scorpius, respectively. Halia crawled into her uncle's lap while Draco started showing them how to sign the names of animals. Dean and Blaze openly snickered. Ron was red-faced in his attempt to hold back, and Ginny, Pansy, and Daphne and the rest looked on. Hermione stopped to watch and think. Maybe this was in their future, too. James was practically vibrating. Don't forget to make the sounds." "That defeats the purpose of sign language." Draco gave James a long look that was returned with a toothy grin. He turned to the others, waiting expectantly, in clear agreement with the oldest child, and signed like a soldier who had lost his last bit of peace. He wasn't winning this one. "Okay." They all cheered. Even Halia clapped without knowing why. Draco looked betrayed, while the majority of the adults were highly entertained. Likely tired from the trip outside and all the attention he had received that day, the puppy roused from the cheering, then snuggled up to Scorpius's leg and went back to sleep. Cleaning was all but forgotten in favor of watching Draco teach and making animal sounds. The kids, and even some of the adults, worked on arranging their hands and fingers as he instructed. She was so engrossed that she only caught Blaze's raised eyebrow, and had only a second to fix her face before he left Padma's side to join her in front of the cake remnants. "I see you once again chosen completely." He nodded at her hand on the counter, and Hermione shoved it in her pocket. "Relax. No need to act suspicious. I can't see anything. I've just become sensitive to charms due to my years in procurement. I have to know when a product is authentic or fake, and people like to use charms to hide things. I can feel something on your hand. Did you tell? It's none of my business how you and Draco wish to make your own announcement. But a bit of advice? There's nothing wrong with enjoying it privately for as long as you want. It becomes a circus of questions and opinions when other people involve themselves in your business." They weren't in a hurry. "Do you regret anything?" "No, but I'm glad we eloped." Blaze's smirk grew at the sight of Draco teaching the children how to sign lion. Then it doubled when Draco committed to convincing roar. Ron's face was redder than his hair, and he looked ready to faint from laughter. "Our families are coming in for a 3-day wedding celebration that's going to test my patience with my mother and her husband, as well as my Hindi knowledge and dancing skills. But I've never been more relaxed because I'm already married, and we did it exactly how we wanted to." Blaze paused. "Of course, this is all just food for thought." "It hasn't been long, if that makes any difference." Time is irrelevant. There was a certain magic in Blaze's eyes when he looked at his wife. 7 years in, and I still learn something new every day. "When did you know?" "I picked out Padma's ring after our first date. She spent most of the detailing, at length, mind you, the reasons why we would never work." A smirk teased the corner of his lips. "Then I got to work on her list. I learned Hindi and her family's culture and customs. I waited until they accepted me to ask, not because I needed time, but because their approval was important to her. It was hard. Her family didn't care for me at first, but I don't consider any of it a hardship because I already knew what I wanted." The same certainty had been in Draco's eyes when he slipped the ring on her finger, and before that, under the olive tree, when he told her he was willing to give everything, when he told her he was a patient man. "Quality over quantity." Blaze rested a hand on her shoulder. 2 months, 2 years, 2 decades, the length of a relationship doesn't matter. Hermione nodded. "Uncle Draco, whales don't sound like that." Al got on his knees. "They sound like this. Mwah-wee!" Scorpius' laughter rang out above the whale imitation from Al, even after Lily and James joined in screeching. Draco looked directly at Hermione, who gave him 2 thumbs up, but his scowl deepened as her grin grew. The look slowly vanished when Scorpius made whale noises too. Expectant blue eyes landed on his father, and more of his agitation withered away. Draco rolled his eyes and made a short whale noise. The kids beamed. Ron choked just before the room erupted with laughter. All the while, Hermione toyed with the ring on her finger. One by one, the children succumbed to their second sugar crash. Dean and Daphne took Halia home, and Harry and Ginny changed their kids and tucked them into the bed with Scorpius before sneaking out for an evening alone. Everyone else followed suit. Free of their guests, Hermione was left alone in the conservatory long enough to pour herself a glass of wine, prop up her feet, and enjoy the night sky. Draco joined her a short time later with 2 fingers of whiskey and a fluffy puppy on his heels. "Everyone still sleeping?" "Everyone except him." Draco nodded at the ball of fur by his feet, but it didn't appear A would be awake much longer. "I set the charm again before I came out." "How did your flu call go with your team?" "How do you know about that?" Draco cut his eyes at her. "Did you listen in?" No, but you've been taking the calls every night for a week now. Hermione looped her arm through his. What's going on? You haven't said much about them. You know my team has been laying traps with your scent in the forest trying to figure out where he is. And one of the traps they left earlier in Sherwood Forest was torn apart. She tensed. Greyback was in that area. We'll start testing the potion there when it's readied in controlled experiments. Do you need help? No, Draco sighed. I have a team handling it. I didn't expect him to catch your scent this soon, which tells me his hiding place has always been somewhere close. My team is combing the area, but I don't have enough to fully search the forest. Not with rumors of an imminent attack on the Ministry. The timing of everything makes me think they're getting desperate. We'll need everyone available. Security demands were at an all-time high. They followed her each time she went to work. People looked, but Hermione ignored their stares. There are always rumors. Not like this. Draco's tone left no room for argument, and truthfully, she was worried. After the attack on the hospital, the reality that it could happen anywhere at any point in time was one she couldn't ignore. If anything happens while you're there, use your necklace and get out. Get Scorpius, my mother, and my aunt, and get out. No matter what, I'll find you. I can fight, you know. Viciously, I'm aware. Draco's look was cool, but his tone spoke of his respect. I wouldn't mind it, but we can't both fight. Logically, she knew he was right, but that didn't settle her nerves. Still, she had to think about more than herself now, and her actions had consequences that led back to the little boy sleeping upstairs surrounded by his friends. That applies to you, too. Hermione cupped his jaw, forcing him to meet her eyes. If something happens, I'll do what you're asking as long as you don't get distracted from your objective either. Eliminating the threat? No. Coming home safely. January 12th, 2012. Catherine appeared to have more questions than answers. Rigorously interviewed, screened for Imperius and other curses the moment she arrived at the Malfoys' empty garden, and then held long enough for any polyjuice to wear off. She was used to this part of the process. Her suspicion started at the curious lack of Draco's presence, then only grew when everyone deferred to Hermione. Catherine passed all the tests, and Hermione cleared the home and checked in with the Aurors at the posts in the neighborhood, before returning to find Catherine in the living room, frowning as she looked around. Sorry for that. Hermione hugged the younger witch in greeting. I know the warding wouldn't have let you in if you had malicious intent, but we're being extra careful right now. I'm used to Mr. Malfoy's paranoia, and you warned me about the testing on the flu call yesterday, but typically he's present for the screenings. Or Mrs. Malfoy. Things must have really changed. They have. Hermione gestured to the flu. Follow me. I'll bring you up to speed. Have you eaten? No, but where is... Draco was home with Scorpius. He's not feeling well today. It had all started with a cough the afternoon before, and worsened as the day went on. He was flushed with a fever, cranky, and wouldn't eat. They'd spent most of the previous night up and down with him, administering child-safe potions while Draco kept him comfortable. Or tried to. In the end, she'd slept curled around him on the sofa, while Draco took the chair, no matter how many times Hermione tried to convince him to go to bed. Oh, is he okay? He'll be fine. I was worried, too, and Draco asked me to run some diagnostics on him, but it's just a seasonal cold. Hermione's living room was empty when they stepped through the flue. Draco was likely upstairs with his son, having taken the day off, so she busied herself making a meal for Catherine. Hermione explained the other witch's future duties in more detail while she ate, and lastly introduced her to the puppy, who took to her instantly. We'll open a flue connection directly between your flat and here, and when you pick up the assignments, Draco's hired car will take you there from your flat, then straight back. Catherine nodded. Is the area near the Malfoys' home still bad? No. Hermione drank her water. Narcissa is more comfortable at her sister's home, and we visit nearly every day. But Draco and Scorpius are staying here permanently. For any questions or concerns, you can come to either of us. There isn't one designated person to handle Scorpius's care. Okay, then. The witch's smile grew slowly. Do you need me to make lunch? No, Zippy will. You can come through after 8. I'm usually home after lunch, but I'm working on a few things. You're free to go after 4. And the itinerary? We decided to let you create it for them. Just make sure there are breaks in playtime. If anything changes, it's fine. Only alert us in an emergency. Catherine looked shocked. You trust me? We both do. She looked honored. And after she left to settle in at home and began working on her schedule for the children, Hermione ventured upstairs to check on Scorpius and Draco. She found them in a place she hadn't expected. Draco was sitting on his bed, watching his sleeping son with something akin to relief. His fever broke. He's healthy. Hermione walked over to the bed, touching the back of her hand to his forehead. Fevers are a sign that the body's immune system is fighting something off. I know, Draco sighed, but there's a small part of me that worries. Hermione shushed him when he stirred, asking her next question quietly so as not to disturb him. Have you ever considered getting him tested? No. Astoria's blood curse affects females in her family every other generation. It's not something I'll have to worry about with him. But his children might. Halia's too. Is that why you're still donating to those trying to develop a cure? Yes, however selfishly. It's not selfish to want to protect your family. It's natural. She looked over at the resting child. Let him sleep. He needs it. Neither were tired, and the night was mild for January, so they took a walk to the greenhouse after setting the charms around Scorpius. Little A went farther into the field to find a spot and came running back to Draco for the praise of a job well done. When he picked the puppy up and scratched under his chin, he paused and turned slowly to find Hermione's eyes on him. Trying to figure out whose dog he is. Scorpius's or yours? Draco held the puppy away from him just a bit before drawing him back to his chest. He's not so bad. And getting healthier. Hermione rubbed his head as they continued toward the greenhouse, not at all noting how Draco, who hadn't even wanted the dog, had been more cognizant of the dog's needs and schedule than even Hermione. He held the door open for her and followed inside, but didn't put A down. The puppy was nosy and some of the plants were toxic, but A didn't mind being coddled. Their walk continued past the hole she dug at the end of the year, past the rose garden Neville had been working with Narcissa to arrange, and they finally ended at a table that held only the daylily, which had bloomed. A rich, deep red. When did that happen? This one bloomed yesterday morning. I've been wondering. Hermione broke off in a laugh and poked him in the arm when he rolled his eyes dramatically. Deny it all you want, but seeds like these aren't easy to come by when the flower is so easy to propagate. Wait. Hermione looked at Draco, who was watching her figure it out with a growing smirk. Seeds are typically used to create new varieties, which means this is not something you happened to pick up during your trip. He said nothing while scratching the puppy behind the ear. I might have requested this strange creation in July as a courting gift. It's tradition, after all. Bred for no purpose except to bloom in winter, and thrive in this climate and soil condition when little else could. Created for her. Because of her. I'll never believe you're not romantic, not when you chose this color. Red, like love, like passion. Draco looked away. You were so focused on the wrong thing that any color would have made you overthink. I wasn't supposed to give it to you when I did, but you were angry about my lack of contact. I was, and then everything changed. Drastically. But in the end, they'd gotten here. They'd bloomed despite her attempts to scorch the earth with the fires of denial. Hemerocallis. Draco's voice was low, but it seized her attention with ease. Beauty for a day. How the daylily got its name. The hybridist was a success. It bloomed on time, in the right color, and it did one last thing I was told would be impossible without magic. What? Each bloom lasts more than one day. January 16th, 2012. Hermione was reminded how much she hated bureaucracy. She'd spent the day delegating tasks, settling disputes, taking urgent meetings, and accepting interdepartmental memos, while Kingsley was otherwise occupied. And just when she thought there would be a lull that lasted long enough to begin reviewing applications for the permanent undersecretary position, she opened her office door and found everyone waiting in a semicircle. Voices blended into one sound, her name. She raised both hands at once. Remember what we discussed. Everyone breathe. The entire office took a collective inhale and then followed with a slow exhale. Very good. First, where is Interim Minister Shacklebolt? Adam stepped forward. He's in negotiations with the Irish ministry over an expired trade agreement. Another thing the ousted minister had let lapse due to his incompetence. He's been in talks all morning. This afternoon he has a meeting with the American president to restore the illegal status of phoenix feathers that also recently expired. Hermione pinched the bridge of her nose. It was a wonder the government had been functional at all. With all the expired agreements, residual messes, and egregious errors, the time spent correcting mistakes made it impossible for Kingsley to be productive, which is where she came in. Very well, then. Hermione cracked her knuckles. What can we handle today? The worst were the interdepartmental fires. Between attrition and lack of order in day-to-day operations under the prior undersecretary, the ministry had gone very lax when people did anything they were told to just keep their positions. A tall brunette woman cleared her throat. The head of the Department of Mysteries is still requesting an audience. Hermione frowned at the mental image of the man. Check my Magi-scheduler and set a meeting next month when Kingsley can be present as well. He won't like that. He's seeking an audience today. We're busy. Hermione had no time or energy to coddle department heads, even if they were instrumental in Kingsley's appointment. She couldn't ignore him, but she didn't have to bend immediately. If there's an issue, let him know he can come to see me directly. My message won't change. The woman nodded to deliver the news. Another person stepped into the abandoned spot. The Wizengamot approved of the reformation of the Public Information Services Department, so the displaced workers are returning to their office, which puts the departments they were sent to into a staffing deficiency. Then we should expand our hiring pool. Another secretary raised her hand. The budget doesn't allow for it. We are understaffed, with a surplus in other areas of the budget. Hermione rubbed her temples. We need to allocate more funds to additional salaries, or we'll risk losing talented, competent workers. A third assistant stepped forward. Magical maintenance is ready to go on strike. Long hours and staffing issues. But I did what you said and checked the applicant pools, and there are a few qualified options. Hermione folded her arms, waiting for the downside. But 2 of them are werewolves. The blonde in the back raised her hand. There are 6 applicants for this department who are werewolves. Are they qualified? Hermione asked blankly. Well, yes. A few were demoted when their status was made public, but then I would be happy to work side by side with any qualified candidate. Hermione looked around at their stunned faces. Their status means nothing, except that they were victimized and unfortunately will have to live with the danger of the prejudice that comes with their affliction. But what it doesn't change is the fact that they are people, and as such, they are entitled to basic rights, including freedom from discrimination. We have passed laws to protect them that haven't been enforced, but Kingsley intends to change that. We can all start right here, right now. Her words hung in the air like a challenge to do better and be better going forward. I understand what you're saying, a brave soul said, but what if they scratch us and... Please educate yourself on lycanthropy. Hermione fought her raising anger. A werewolf was one of the best teachers I've ever had, and one of the bravest men I've ever known. It would be a disservice if you allowed bigotry and misinformation to sour your opinion of people you don't even know. Lycanthropy is a disease that affects people, just like you and me. I hope if I were ever in their position, someone wouldn't consider me less of a person for having a disease. A fidgety, uncomfortable silence permeated the room, but Hermione didn't allow it to linger. Please continue your questions. I would like a word in private. A deep, familiar voice rose from the back of the group. Official business. Every head turned and a few stepped to the side, revealing Draco dressed in Navy task force robes, relaxed with his arms folded and long legs stretched out, but there was no telling how long he'd been waiting in the chair beside Dolores's desk. Task Force Leader Malfoy. Draco stood with fluid ease and approached slowly, ignoring all eyes on him. Everyone, we'll resume shortly. Hermione kept her tone even. Please excuse us. When they were alone and a privacy charm was activated, Hermione leaned against the side of her desk. Draco rarely visited during work hours, which meant something was going on. Whatever it was didn't stop him from greeting her with a kiss that carried a fraction of the heat in his eyes. You're acclimating well to leadership, I see. Draco cocked a brow. You've been doing this 2 weeks, and yet... I'm quick on my feet, you know this. Besides, you know my philosophy. Large differences on a small scale. He looked down for an instant. "But the tone you're implementing, even in a small setting, will spread. It's not a new reform, and you're downplaying yourself," says the person who did the same when he declined a Wizengamot seat. Hermione met his gaze boldly with irritation flashed in his eyes. "We'll table this discussion for now. You said you were here on official business." "I am." He folded his arms. "I'm assuming you haven't heard the news about the trial." "Outside of it ending today, with the verdict unlikely until tomorrow. No, I haven't heard anything yet. I've been buried all morning. Tiberius and the minister were found guilty by the Council of Magical Law. Unanimous vote based on all the evidence and testimonies." Mind racing from the news. Hermione was glad she leaned on something sturdy. She hadn't expected the verdict so quickly. "When is their sentencing?" "In 3 days. Draco didn't look at all that pleased. They'll be sentenced at the same time as my uncle, who didn't fight any of his charges." "What's the caveat?" "The Wizengamot has to sentence them." January 19th, 2012. The air was charged with the tense expectancy that kept Hermione's stomach in knots. Every seat available in the large chamber was taken by protesters, victims, and families alike. Reporters from various newspapers gathered along the back wall and framed the largest meeting hall's doors, which were left open to allow the mass of spectators just beyond to listen in. For those who couldn't fit in the overcrowded space, a broadcast was playing through the atrium in real time, too. Seated next to the court reporter, Hermione glanced over at the young witch, who looked both excited and nervous. "This is my first hearing," she said. "I know I'm supposed to be impartial, but I hope they get the maximum sentence. My brother is a patient in the Janus Thickery ward now, after the attack at the Quidditch match." "I'm sorry to hear—" The rest of Hermione's statement was lost to the sound of murmurs when Kingsley entered the room in formal robes, and everyone rose to their feet, only sitting again after he did. Tiberius and his advocate were already inside, along with the minister. Security lined the walls, Harry amongst them, as well as Draco's task force, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen, yet. Draco was in charge of delivering his uncle to the courtroom. The heavy clang of shackles being dragged across the floor sent a shiver down Hermione's spine. Rabaston's grin was positively mad. The side door opened shortly after, and the Wizengamot members filed out in their plum robes, taking their seats and citing their last names for the record. It was the last hearing before their break, and the last hearing Percy would attend as a member of the public before joining their ranks. With no chief warlock, Kingsley called the meeting to order. Today's hearing would be brief. A select few witnesses would testify to the crimes Tiberius and the minister were already convicted of. A clerk for the court would read off Rabaston's uncontested charges. Then the only thing left was sentencing. Whether the punishments matched the crimes would tell the story of how deep corruption ran within the Wizengamot. Cormac took the stand first, looking around nervously and appearing far less confident than he had the last time she'd seen him. But he spoke the truth Percy had been wringing out of him for the last month under the threat of the vow. Following him, other victims spoke, including Mather's family and those most egregiously wronged. Order had to be called a few times when the crowd got restless, but most everyone behaved in the name of justice being served, Hermione included. And she exercised restraint upon taking the stand to talk about the crimes committed under her personally because Padma hadn't wanted to attend. What she didn't expect was Tiberius rising to his feet while she was on the stand. "I'd like to bargain." His previous smug surety was nowhere to be found. "Everything I know in exchange for a reduced sentence." "The time for negotiations ended with your conviction," Percy lazily replied from his chair. Kingsley sat up straighter. A few people in the crowd stood despite being seated in different rows. Hermione locked eyes with Harry. I know where their main location is." Tiberius was undeterred. "I know everything about their operation. Who is in it, how far it reaches. Polyjuice! They have an endless supply of it, and—" "Tisk, tisk." Rabaston's smile was chilling. "My brother won't be pleased by this disloyalty." Draco's wand pressed tighter against his throat. "Quiet." "I've already told you." His uncle just laughed, rotting teeth on display. "He's coming for me." He'd repeated it over and over, for days and weeks now, a rumor of his own making stated as if it were a fact. More stood. Those who were still seated looked around in question. Hermione subtly reached inside her pocket of her robes for her wand. Something was wrong. "Please be seated." Kingsley's request was polite, but his tone held power. The Wizengamot members shifted in their seats. "Hello, Kingsley," said the person standing in the front row. A ripple passed over their features. Then they began twisting, changing. She knew that voice. Several things happened at once. A body knocked her to the floor, shielding her. A flash of blinding light. Explosions rattled her to the bone. Her ears rang so loudly it drowned out everything else. Chaos sang its tune in a chorus of explosions. Screams of panic and a stampede of footsteps layered verses over the hum of spells and melody of the magic in the air as oars fought off the attack. Kingsley's voice was a calm presence, counting each blast on beat, until they stopped. For 2 seconds, then 5, then 10. Half a minute passed before Kingsley told her to stay down, and he left her side. Every sense was dulled by the pandemonium. Her vision was still spotty from the flare, but she rubbed her hands over her eyes as many times as it took to clear. And that's when she noticed it. A familiar cloud. Poison. Shaking the dizziness away, Hermione peered out from around the witness stand. The cloud was too thick to see anything beyond flashes of color. Red spells, purple hexes, green curses. She had to do something, like isolate the poison cloud. But Hermione only managed to trap a portion of it when someone grabbed her ankle. She kicked herself free, scrunching as far out of sight as possible. She locked eyes with the old minister, just as a streak of green magic struck him. His body stilled and went slack, eyes still open. Dead. She didn't wait for his attacker to find her. Hermione crawled out from her hiding spot in the direction of the court reporter's booth. It was times like these when her ability to segment and catalog and store information was invaluable. She could process this later. Wade through what it meant to see the sheer volume of bodies strewn across the floor covered in ash and poison. Logically, she knew some were moving, but it was all too obvious most were not. If she were any less adept at separating logic from emotion and doing what needed to be done, she might wind up right alongside them. There was no time to dwell. On her crawl, she caught sight of Percy, leading those who could flee out behind several protection charms. Kingsley taking on 2 Death Eaters, and Harry and Draco back-to-back fighting Rodolphus and both Caros. An unbelievable amount of civilians were fighting off a horde of Death Eaters. Brave protesters were taking up for the cause. To her surprise, the court reporter had survived the blast. The young witch looked terrified, and Hermione barely had enough time to stop her bleeding and cover her mouth with a bubblehead charm before they were spotted. "Don't move." Rabaston was heading in Draco and Harry's direction, and Hermione's wand was out and firing a spell before she knew what was happening. Like an out-of-body experience, Hermione watched her magic run its course. Rabaston's body bounced off the ceiling with enough force to render him unconscious before he landed on the ground like a rag doll, limbs angled in odd directions and blood pooling beneath his head. He didn't move. A screech pierced the air before spellfire centered in her direction, leaving scorch marks on the stone. Hermione conjured a protective shield around herself and the court reporter. During a brief lull, as the attacker drew closer, Hermione caught sight of them. The woman looked oddly familiar. A second later, she remembered why. The park attack. The woman from the park blocked Hermione's next spell, then the next, firing off a few of her own in the process. They went tit for tat, spell for spell. The attacker fought each spell off with growing ferocity until a stunner caught her. But it wasn't Hermione's. The stunner had come from behind her. Before she could figure it out, someone grabbed her elbow and tugged. Hermione spun around, wand at the ready, and saw Draco, who looked surprised and a bit furious. "What are you still doing here?" he hissed, then ducked into a hiding spot with her and the injured court reporter. "We agreed. You're supposed to be gone." "We did agree, but Hermione gestured to the witch. "She needs help." "I'll get her out, but you'll have to hide until I can." Draco scrubbed a hand over his face. "But you need to go." "Don't make me come back and find you." She caught the bruises forming along his jaw and healed them with the touch of whispered magic. "Remember your end of the agreement, too. Come home safely." "Anti-apparition wards are up, but you can get past them." Draco caught her hand and kissed her wrist. "Use it." Hermione knew what to do. Grasping her compass and closing her eyes, she pressed her finger against the dial. The pull took her home. She landed in the conservatory with a clamor loud enough to wake the whole house. Pansy rushed downstairs first. Wands drawn and drinks in hand, Ginny, Susan, Daphne, and Padma were at Pansy's back. An impromptu girls' night. What a shame she would have to ruin the fun. "The ministry's under attack," Hermione gasped. Horror dawned on Pansy's face. "Percy? Is he—" "He was fine last I saw him, helping people get out." Hermione got to her feet and ran to the fireplace. Her first call was to Theo, who would need to mobilize. The children were in the greenhouse with Luna, Narcissa, and Andromeda. When she finished, she turned, expecting Pansy to still look alarmed, but she was the picture of ferocity. Ginny and Daphne were already summoning everyone inside. Susan rushed over to Hermione with a towel. "Your ears are bleeding." There were bombs, poison. Shock began to numb her as adrenaline ebbed, slowing its manic hum. Susan made her sit and breathe through the withdrawal. "Anti-apparition wards are set up at the ministry. I had to use my necklace to get out. Someone should check all the wards here to be safe and make sure the flue is secured. Anyone who needs to get here already has access or another way in." Everyone stayed together, locked down following Blaze, Ron, and Dean's arrival to wait out the storm. Hermione forced a smile as she looked around the room. "I'm sure they'll be here soon." Time passed in virtual silence. Seconds stretched into minutes, which added up to hours until they resumed some semblance of normality for the children, who only knew something was very, very wrong. Narcissa went to her room at her sister's behest and fell asleep shortly after from the stress. Most of the others nodded off wherever they sat when their eyes could no longer stay open. Andromeda stayed awake as long as she could, asking questions about Kingsley, and Hermione told her as much as she knew. He had been alive and uninjured the last time she'd been there. It would have to do. Midnight came and went. Hermione had stopped herself 3 times from going back. Scorpius's head was a steady weight on her thigh when a crash from the conservatory made her jump. As quickly as possible, she settled Scorpius on the cushion and rushed to the source of the shattered glass that marked someone's arrival. The only ones awake, she and Susan skidded into the conservatory to find Draco. Alive. Dirty, with wet hair and smelling like decontaminant. But alive. His eyes were swollen shut, and blood dripped from his fingertips. One shoulder was clearly wrenched out of socket. Hermione was already ignoring Susan's attempt to treat his wounds when Draco wrapped his good arm around her and hugged her close. Draco leaned on her, too heavily, and he was panting like he'd run all the way here from the ministry. "They're dead. My uncles, they're dead." His disbelief was palpable. "It's finally finished." "You're bleeding, Malfoy." Susan approached his other side, summoning a parchment and casting the first diagnostic charms. "Fuck! It's a wasting curse!" Much like the one he'd been hit with the night his father died. Draco barked out a delirious laugh while Susan yelled for help. Padma rushed in. Hermione was frozen, but not for long. In the midst of the growing cloud of fear, determination cut through like sunshine. "I can fix this. I can fix this." Susan vanished his jacket and shirt and found the source of the curse eating away at the muscles of his back. She gagged at the sight. "Shite! It's spreading! The only way to contain this is to slow this heartbeat. Calming draft. Give me a calming draft." "Won't work fast enough or long enough," Padma argued. "Draft of living death." Hermione looked at her shocked friends. "It'll buy time." "It's risky," Susan blinked, "and we can't do it here." Padma ran to retrieve the vial. With Blaze's help, they stretched Draco out on the floor on the side. Hermione laid with him, keeping him calm as his internal temperature dropped, despite repeating warming charms. Each breath grew more and more ragged. His eyes swam in and out of focus, taking on a glassy sheen. Hermione swept her fingers across his forehead. "I have to—" "Trust you," Draco mumbled. He was going into shock, and fading fast as his pallor dimmed to a sickly gray. Twisting in agony, he grasped thin threads of consciousness with what little remained of his strength. "Are you sure?" Susan handed Hermione the uncorked vial. "It'll work." There was no other option. Hermione held the vial to his lips. In trust, there was no fear. "Drink." Pain will leave you when you let go. Jeremy Aldana.